So I, sitting in my role at ClinicalTrials.gov, am really privileged because I sit at the intersection, or really cross-section, of the clinical trial enterprise. And our website is really intended to serve multiple purposes, both the scientific value of providing accountability to the way that research is conducted and the way that research is reported, as well as this other aspect of eligibility and more of the individual aspect of people wanting to find trials of interest that matter to them. And so, of course, with that, come some tensions in being able to fulfill all of the goals with which the site is intended. But because our topic is about sort of the future, I feel that in order to talk about the future, you do have to reflect on the past a little bit. And I also want to ensure that people know a few key points about our site and then putting that in the context of the future. I also recently learned from a podcast that there's no such thing as the present. We're only either in the future or the past. So those are the two things that I'll cover. So at ClinicalTrials.gov, one of the things that we were asked to consider as part of the regulation and rulemaking process that expanded which trials are required to be reported to us, and also that added the requirement to submit results to us, was whether or not that results information should also be accompanied by a narrative summary that would be intended for a more general audience, such as the public. And one of the things, though, that was included within the law that we were supposed to consider as part of this process was whether those summaries could be performed in a way in which we could ensure that they were not promotional or misleading. And so that was what we sought comment on while going through the process of considering whether we should be including these summaries within the ClinicalTrials.gov database and summaries about the results of trials. And we were particularly interested in understanding current methods and practices for being able to ensure that we could meet those criteria. And we were concerned because there wouldn't be a systematic process for validation of that information. We receive 600 new trial registrations every week, and we post 120 new results records every week. That's a massive amount of information, and thinking about how to ensure that information is meeting the needs of the public is certainly a real challenge and a real interest, of course. So there's concerns about how to ensure that those summaries would be independent of bias and would not, have opinions going into the interpretation of those trial results. Oddly enough, we didn't really receive many comments on methods that could be used in that process. So in that context, we decided to defer that decision basically and indicated that we would be eagerly following research and other things that are happening in this space. And if we were to consider sort of including that as a requirement in the future, we would go through yet another rulemaking process. But there are a few beneficial things that came out of that discussion and that were also products of that rulemaking. And one of those was that as we were considering, well, what vetted pieces of information are out there, one of the documents that kept coming up and up again was the informed consent document. This is a document that is supposed to be intended to be read by someone who would be participating in a clinical trial and in a way that they could understand that information, and presumably that's reviewed by an independent body also. So we did include basically as a concession, as we were considering this issue, that we would make available a mechanism for informed consent documents to be posted publicly on ClinicalTrials.gov to accompany that study record. And then, as was spoken to earlier, when the common rule revisions came out, it is now a requirement to post that informed consent document if that study is funded by a federal agency and covered by the common rule. So there's basically a whole new trove of informed consent documents that are publicly available now on the ClinicalTrials.gov website, and I think are a real opportunity to think about how as a community we can be evaluating those documents, identifying best practices, and really leveraging those to be improving that process. The other thing that came out of the rulemaking was that we also now, with the results information that we're posting, are requiring the full protocol document and the statistical analysis plan to be reported with that results information to allow for its evaluation. And another thing that we clarified as part of the regulations was that when the registration information is posted, there are two fields that are intended to be targeted for the more general audience and should be written in plain language. And that's the brief summary. It's basically, the first few sentences on every study record indicating what that study is about. And it's an area where we haven't yet issued guidance providing, best practices around that particular field, but it's definitely an area in the future that we all aim to improve, and there's a lot of opportunities there in terms of making that more accessible to the public. Kind of my final point about both the past and the future is that our registration information on ClinicalTrials.gov is meant to be a representation of the information that's in the protocol document itself. It's a summary of the information that's considered to be most important from that study protocol, so focusing on study design, eligibility criteria, and of course the outcome measures that are anticipated to be assessed. I think what's really changed is no one envisioned at the beginning of the creation of protocol documents that these would now be the source of information for public dissemination about that clinical trial. And so how the protocol document is used has really transformed. And I don't think yet that the way in which the documents are created at inception has yet transformed to consider the ways that that information is going to get redisseminated and reused. And so I think there's a real opportunity in really thinking about what the purpose of that protocol document is and how it can serve not only the study team and their own communication needs, but also more broadly the general public. And just finally, I'll make a point related to that. We recently did some evaluation work on our website a couple years ago, and we took into consideration all of the different audiences that use our website: patients, researchers, healthcare providers. And we were really interested in understanding how they were understanding a few key concepts on our site. And we were really surprised when even our most frequent and advanced users didn't quite fully understand one of the key concepts we have. And so we went to kind of rework some of that stuff, and we decided to prioritize kind of the needs of patients as we were revising some of that content. And what we found is that when we prioritized patients, we didn't actually compromise the needs of our other users. And in fact, it seemed to better support all of our users. And so I think that's an important consideration, that sometimes we think by changing the way we approach communicating with people that maybe we're going to lose one of our audiences. And what our experience was that it actually really brought all of our audiences to a more common understanding that wouldn't have been possible if we weren't prioritizing kind of those general needs. And so I'll close with that, and we'll move to discussion.